Hey everyone, Joshua Kirk here with you once again, and now it's time for episode 220 of Album of the Day, in which for today's album review, I'm going to be reviewing the new album by I think he's an Oregon-based singer-songwriter and multi-instrumentalist, or was one, because unfortunately he was one of the few indie artists in which we lost in 2018. But he's been very influential to a lot of indie records across over the last decade, and he's put out a few solo records on his own too. But he was like some people didn't even realize how influential he was to this umbrella of music. Of course, I'm talking about the musician and songwriter known as Richard Swift, who has produced a bunch of other people's records from people like Foxygen and Kevin Morby and Nathaniel Rateliff, as well as playing on stage with bands like the Shins and the Black Keys. But unfortunately, he did pass away in July of 2018, and I'm here to review his new posthumous album, which was released on September 21st of 2018, and the album is called The Hex. And as you can see, I own this on vinyl here. I'll tell you, when I first found out that Richard Swift died, it actually wasn't until 2 months after he died and when this album was out. I was listening to All Songs Considered, and of course I had found out that this record was his last album, and I'll tell you, my heart was broken because I have a lot of respect for this guy's work in the past. For that Foxygen record, We Are the 21st Century Ambassadors, A Piece of Magic, as well as some of his other production work. I always thought he had a really cool singing voice that was definitely very unique, and his production style was always so you could hear the room in which he was recording when you listened to it. Really cool front cover, which is like a photo of Richard Swift as a kid, but with extra little artwork on there, so it looks very warped. And then there's the back, which there's 11 tracks on here. It's 37 minutes long. Pretty minimal liner notes there. And this album actually does feature his children singing backup vocals on here. This is a really simple insert, but it's kind of cool. Of course, it has some really interesting artwork, and it says, I remember you telling me about the Hex. And then on the back it has handwritten lyrics for the very last song Richard Swift wrote, which is the last song on this record, September 20th. And Secretly Canadian is the label that put out this album. It is a long-time record label. There's side A, and then there's side B. Yeah, I finally got to listen to this on vinyl. Definitely really like how it sounds on vinyl, especially since you could hear the room ambience in what he was recording. Like he always loved reverb and sound. Excuse me. And that's the album packaging for The Hex, the posthumous album by Richard Swift. Now, while I definitely was, pretty sad to hear that Richard Swift had passed away, which I heard that the cause was organ failure from drinking problems. I don't know why, but for some reason, whenever artists die, usually if they have an album about to be released, that was recorded and written before their death, I'm usually kind of interested to hear what it sounds like and hear what the final sort of statement one artist has to say about them. Like, I feel that way with, like, Sharon Jones' posthumous record from 2017. And, of course, obviously, the masterpiece that is Black Star, even though Bowie didn't die until 2 days after the album was released. This album, he really gets to the point here in the lyrical content, but it also showed that, he was also improving as a producer and as a songwriter, so it's kind of devastating that, we're not going to hear any more new Richard Swift music after this, because this definitely is some of his best work to date. Of course, the album opens up with the title track, The Hex, which features these these kind of spooky mellotron strings, and it's a kind of dreary drum machine, as well as some really odd kind of percussion that sounds to me like a computer mouse sort of clicking, like tick, 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 tick. But these elements work so well together over his very emotional vocal performance. He pretty much opens the song pretty blunt by saying, "There's no reason I want to kill peace to anyone. I never wanted the hex. I never needed the hex." So it's kind of like a perfect little kind of prologue for this album. Right there. But then you follow that up with the song Broken Finger Blues, which definitely is one of the big standouts here. I love its jaunty piano and drums, as well as some of the other kind of odder instruments he throws in there, like a really nice harpsichord on there. Some catchy little like background falsetto vocals on there. And it really does show that one of Richard Swift's many talents was being able to take like old familiar sounds and literally kind of make them sound very modern and kind of bending its edges a little bit without being too experimental to the point where he's just hard for the casual listener to get into. Excuse me. And this song really does, and I feel like this is one of the few songs on here where he really does sort of delve pretty head on into his struggles with depression and stuff like that. Like, sort of he does open up the song by saying, "I need a shelter, I need a friend, someone to hold me, to lend a hand." Excuse me. And I really like how he sounds very kind of pensive and melancholy in the beginning, but then he just kind of gets real cathartic by the end by putting on a very emotional sort of performance, which I think that's one of the big selling points of this record, is that Richard Swift's singing throughout this album is definitely very satisfying, and he pretty much knew the end was coming and, didn't want to disappoint with his final album. And then the song Selfishmath is definitely one of the weirder, more psychedelic kind of tracks on here, but it has one of the stickiest hooks on the entire album. A reason I changed. It's just so catchy, the way he blends together the psychedelic bass line and the kind of cheeky falsetto vocals together. Together on here, it really is one really good example of Swift's ability to create a really timeless hook. But then we also have songs on here that are about members of his family who died. So it's really a lot to take in, because not only is this his last album, but he is sort of really openly talking about how devastated and how crushed he was when some members of his family died. Like, for example, the song Wendy is about his late mother. mother, where you definitely hear lyrics where he's having a moment of introspection, but then you kind of see that part of the reason for that is because he's had to like kind of carry around baggage that did include the death of his mother. And I really like his vocal performance on here. He just sounds very confident, and he actually kind of sounds almost kind of ready for death to come to him, because he's had to deal with it like a few times in his life. And also, I do really like the chorus is really cool. The way he incorporates backup vocals from some of his children, but it sounds like really cool on there, and cool on there for sure. But I think the one track on here that's about a late family member that I think really that really gave me chills here was the song Nancy. Definitely one of the best tracks on here. Like the production on this song is killer. Like the drums sound really good. Like I love the kind of the reverb he puts on the drums. So when you hear a big like sort of crash, you'll hear boom boom, boom boom, psh, boom boom, boom boom, psh. Like it sounds really cool over a kind of fuzzy bass line, and then he kind of throws some tambourine in there too. And some really gorgeous like mellotron strings on here too. And he sort of and this song definitely is one of the most cathartic songs I think here on this record, because he really is sort of admitting that all this time it's been very hard to deal with his losing his sister too young. So they're too young. And his vocal performance on here is like really good, really good, and definitely makes his lyrics very believable in that moment where he is just like belting it out and going into his higher range. Like I really feel it in my gut. Like that's a sign of this track being one of the highlights and key tracks of this record. This record and the way, and of course this is another track that does incorporate the lovely harpsichord. Now this record definitely is now this record definitely is a kind of heartbreaking album thematically, but that doesn't mean that this album doesn't have some incredibly catchy tracks on here. I already highlighted songs like Selfishmath and Wendy that I think are very catchy. But then we have the song Dirty Jim that has a really killer honky-tonk piano melody going on that will definitely instantly stick with you. Instantly stick with you. And on this song he does sort of talk. And on this song, he does sort of talk about how he like tried to give his peers like everything he could, and he had like always been really like true and heartfelt to them, but now he sort of has to tell them that thing that isn't necessarily the easiest thing to tell them. Like every color is black and blue. And it's definitely leaves quite an impression on that final verse where he says, every daughter in my home, every one I've left alone, sorry for the tears I gave to you, but every color now is shining through. And his vocal performance, you could almost hear, like, in moments like the beginning of the chorus, you can hear almost the suffering in his voice. It sounds as though it's being recorded in a room in which he is like just kind of having a moment of like losing his mind and kind of having his demons kind of take over. But it doesn't like sound like but it doesn't sound like painful to listen to. It actually sounds quite gorgeous to hear him just kind of deal with his depression. But then he does follow it up by saying, got the strength, believe it or not, every second is a battle I fought, which is pretty much the truth about what he's dealing with here. There are a couple of moments on here that I think are kind of lulls for me. Most in particular the song Babylon, which definitely, I liked the song at first, but then after a while, like the do 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 melody after a while definitely got kind of old and sort of lost flavor a little bit for me. Though I do really like his kind of fuzzy vocal performance and the cheeky Babylon, Babylon backup vocals are a little much. Are just like a little much. And then we have the song Sister Song, Sister Song, while it does have a really cool fuzzy guitar outro, its melody is pretty okay, but I've heard this melody on like a million other records done by a bunch of other people, and the song as a whole just kind of comes off as kind of underwhelming. But the last few tracks on the album are definitely very strong. I really like that instrumental track towards the end. That's called HZLWD. Like, I don't know if it's supposed to translate to a word or if it's just, a bunch of letters. But either way, great track. And it really does show, like, his production skills very nicely. The way that the instruments are, like, sort of working with one another is, like, really nice. It's kind of eerie and melancholy, but at the same time, it's, like, very beautiful and almost actually kind of hopeful. I mean, it's funny that even though funny, like, considering this is the final recordings of Richard Swift, there's still a little bit of optimism to be found here. Here, like, on this track, definitely just show a little bit of light in its melodies. And I really like that kind of, barroom harpsichord that's incorporated in there. The bass and the drums create a really tight rhythm section amongst the driving pianos. Pianos on there. There's some odd electronic noises to be heard on here. And then the ending, synth beep sound, which I don't know if that's like coming from a synth or a sampler or something like that. But either way, it does a good job of sort of kind of mirroring the depression struggles that he is dealing with. But then it's followed up with the crazy track Kensington, which is definitely one of the odder tracks on here, but most definitely more fun than Babylon. I will tell you that. That it's got a really cool kind of spoken word on it, which I know, like, for some listeners that may come off as just a throwaway track, but but I really like the way it works over some kind of wailing guitars and a funky rhythm section, and it's pretty intriguing during that part where he gets real climactic into this stream of consciousness sort of monologue, and he's just like wailing away on the guitar. It sounds awesome, I will say that. And it's got some really kind of odd, sort of nutty background vocals would sound really cool in there. And the song has a really kind of odd sort of lo-fi outro that features like some sounds of feedback and stuff like that, sort of telling you that this was very much like down to the wire kind of stuff for Richard Swift. And then, of course, we follow it up with the very last song Richard Swift ever wrote, which is the song September 20th. And I will say, definitely the perfect closer for this record. record. It's very minimal instrumentation. It's basically just got nothing but a piano and a lead vocal and a bunch of different stacked background vocals. But it sounds so lush and gorgeous. And he definitely puts, and his vocal on here is definitely very good. Because like throughout the song, I believe every word he says all the way down to that pretty satisfying final lyric in the second verse, like slip away, asleep in my car, or all the angels sing, que sera, sera. Raw, and that ooh, like that kind of spooky moan that he does in the background is definitely very gorgeous as well. Gorgeous as well. It definitely is one of his greatest tracks. His tracks for sure. Not only on this album, but like I think of his career. So yeah, overall, definitely a really good like final statement from Richard Swift right here. His work will definitely live on for generations to come, and it will definitely age well for sure. He definitely was one of the most sort of inventive kind of producers to sort of breathe new life back in the old sounds. And he definitely has like done a lot for other people, which is why when he died, there were definitely plenty of notices from like various artists, like Dan Auerbach of the Black Keys did tweet rest in peace Richard Swift, and also I heard that there was actually a Richard Swift tribute show that happened where a variety of different artists, some of which have worked with him, actually covered all the songs off of this record. So definitely really cool to see other people kind of celebrate like how talented of a musician and songwriter he was. So yeah. So as for the album, I give the Hex an 8.0 out of 10. Like, it may not be as high on my year-end list as would other records, but it definitely deserves a recommendation for sure. So, that's my review for The Hex, the new album by Richard Swift. I'll see you for episode 221.